The number is 8,000. That is how many premature infants are said to have passed through Martin County's incubator exhibitions. Between 1,896 and 1,943, 8,000 babies carried into glass boxes on a Coney Island boardwalk and displayed to paying crowds between the sword swallower and the tattooed lady. The official story says the spectacle saved them. The official story says Couney was a hero. The official story rarely lingers on the logistical question. Where did 8,000 premature babies come from in an era when premature births were barely counted, barely recorded, and often treated as inevitable losses? I have been sitting with that question for months, and I do not have a clean answer. What I have is a pattern that gets sharper the longer you look. Start with what can be pinned down. In 1896, a man presenting himself as Dr. Martinet, Coney opened his first incubator show at a European exposition. The problem is that his doctorhood never settles into the kind of documentation modern readers expect. Historians searching licensing rosters and university records run into gaps and contradictions. His identity shifts like stage scenery. Names changed, dates blurred, credentials polished until they were smooth enough to pass a quick inspection. One thread places his birth in 1,869 inches, Prussian Poland, his arrival in the United States as a teenager, and his early work closer to surgical instruments than to a hospital ward. He changed his name more than once. He spoke with confidence. He built a persona so thoroughly that later researchers still cannot reconstruct a fully verified biography. And yet for nearly half a century, this man with an unstable paper trail operated what functioned, in practice, like the most consistent neonatal care program in America. Hospitals knew he existed. The medical establishment knew he existed. Child welfare authorities knew he existed and tried repeatedly to shut him down. Newspapers knew where to find him when they wanted a sentimental feature about tiny miracles. And still, for decades, very few hospitals replaced what he was doing with anything comparable. As late as 1,939, a typical New York hospital might have a single incubator. Couney had rows of them, plus trained technicians and wet nurses on payroll. He claimed survival around 85% for infants admitted to his care. Meanwhile, many hospitals had survival rates for premature infants that were functionally zero, not because saving was impossible, but because institutions often did not try. That detail makes the story less quirky and more structural. Couney was not simply clever. He was doing what others decided was not worth doing. You can see the reasoning in the medical thinking of the time. Premature infants were described as weak, the work of saving them framed as inefficient, the resources better spent elsewhere. This was not fringe medicine. It was a mainstream logic for decades. If a baby arrived too small and too early, the loss could be accepted as natural, and the paperwork, if it existed at all, could be minimal. So Couney filled the gap. He staged incubators at world's fairs and amusement parks. He charged a small admission fee and did not bill parents. He dressed recovering babies in oversized clothes so spectators could see how tiny they had been, and nurses demonstrated scale with props that made crowds gasp. It was showmanship, and there is no getting around that. But it was also care. And in a country that had largely refused to build that care inside hospitals, the care happened where the money and attention were, inside a tent by the midway. And then the question returns, harder. Where did the babies come from? Couney said hospitals referred them. Some did. Sometimes frantic parents brought infants directly, but 8,000 over 47 years is not a trickle of coincidences. It is sustained, institutional scale intake of the most medically fragile human beings, routed through a man with no stable credentials, operating in public as entertainment. Think about the machinery required. Someone supplied equipment. Someone helped staff learn procedures. Someone ensured heat, sanitation, and an ongoing flow of supplies. Someone, in city after city, allowed premature infants to be moved through streets and into an amusement park. It did not have to be officially endorsed to be practically tolerated. It only needed enough people willing to look away while benefiting from the outcome. That willingness to look away was not limited to medicine. These same decades were thick with other systems built on the idea that children could be categorized, moved, and redistributed by institutions that answered to limited oversight. Between the mid-1800s and 1929, Organizations placed an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 children onto orphan trains, shipping them from eastern cities to rural families across the Midwest. Witnesses described depot scenes that resembled auctions. Children lined up, inspected, chosen. A sturdy child might be taken for farm labor. A sickly child might be passed over. Tags were sewn into clothing for tracking, but tracking was partial and often lost. As many as a quarter of the children on those trains had living parents. Agencies judged those parents unfit and removed children without what we would now recognize as due process. No comprehensive database was compiled. Many placed children never found their biological families again. The trains ended in 1929. Couney's exhibits ran from 1896 to 1943. The overlap is 33 years. Same cities, same social gradients, same assumptions about whose children were surplus and who had the authority to decide. I am not claiming a single hidden filing cabinet links these programs. I am saying they shared an infrastructure of belief that some children could be moved, displayed, or vanished with little accountability, and that the public would accept it as administration, charity, or progress. Because eugenics was not hidden in this period, it was mainstream, polite, and confident. Better Babies contests spread through state fairs. Infants weighed and measured, scored by physicians on rubrics borrowed from livestock judging. Tens of thousands of babies were evaluated. Awards were sponsored. Headlines celebrated perfect children, as if breeding were the point. Black children were excluded by explicit policy. Perfection was defined as white by design. Under that smile sat harsher policy. States passed compulsory sterilization laws, and in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld forced sterilization in Buck v. Bell. Over the 20th century, tens of thousands of Americans were sterilized under state authority. This was not a secret movement. It wrote itself into law. There is another artifact that keeps reappearing when people try to understand the period. The strange flood of early 20th century postcards showing babies as commodities pulled from cabbage patches, fished from rivers, loaded into baskets like produce, delivered by train. They were sent as birth announcements, often anonymous, mass-produced across Europe and the United States. In isolation, they read as whimsical evasions of sex education, a joke shared between adults, but set beside orphan trains, Better Babies scorecards, sterilization statutes, and incubator shows. The imagery shifts. Babies become units to be harvested, shipped, sorted, awarded, or discarded. Some cards, when translated carefully, flirt with language of relocation and repopulation, as if children were a resource to be managed. Maybe it is coincidence. Maybe it is simply the era's visual metaphor. But the clustering is hard to unsee once it has been pointed out, and it makes the blank spots in the record feel less accidental. Now hold the contradiction. In one building at a fairground, Couney and his staff fought to keep premature infants alive in warmed glass boxes. Nearby, physicians scored babies for genetic fitness. The infants Couney saved too small, too weak, born wrong, were exactly the kind of babies the surrounding ideology implied should be allowed to disappear. When you see those systems side by side, Couney stops looking like a lone eccentric. A lone eccentric does not operate for 47 years across multiple cities without some form of institutional accommodation. If you spend any time online now, you can watch the story mutate. Couney appears in viral threads and short-form documentaries, black and white photos, a narrator promising the doctor hospitals didn't want you to know, a quick tear-jerker ending. Comment sections split into predictable tribes. One side posts heart emojis and calls him a saint. Another side calls him a grifter and insists it was all exploitation. The algorithm rewards whatever compresses best into 30 seconds. Miracle. Fire. Freaks saving babies. Doctors refusing care. The messier questions, referrals, records. Missing infants get fewer likes because they don't fit the beat of a reveal. Scroll long enough and you start seeing amateur archivists doing what institutions never did, stitching fragments into a map. Someone posts a scan of an old admission card. Someone else replies with a photo of an incubator ticket stub found in a grandparent's drawer. A nurse on YouTube reacts to early incubator designs and points out what would still be recognizable in a modern NICU. A historian on a podcast cautions that the 8,000 figure likely aggregates multiple venues and years with uneven accounting. Fact-checkers duel with storytellers. One side demanding primary sources, the other insisting that absence of records proves a cover-up. The platform rewards certainty, so nuance becomes a performance too. Here's what we know, delivered in the same cadence as, here's what they hid. That online collision matters because it mirrors the era's collision. Care entangled with spectacle, knowledge entangled with marketing. In the early 1900s, crowds learned that tiny babies could live because they watched them live. The lesson came wrapped in admission fees and gawking. Today, the lesson comes wrapped in engagement metrics. The medium changes. The incentives rhyme. Those platforms also flatten the moral into hero versus villain. But history's uglier truth is often systemic. Institutions can hold monstrous ideas when those ideas are framed as efficiency, science, or national improvement. Couney's tent becomes less a quirky exception and more a mirror held up to what respectable medicine accepted. On the 27th of May 1911, Dreamland at Coney Island burned. The fire spread fast. Animals died. Crowds watched chaos unfold. Inside the incubator building, smoke pushed towards 6 premature babies. Nurses ran in, wrapped each infant, and carried them out into the street. People who helped were the sideshow performers, the ones society labeled disposable. Early reports claimed the incubator babies died. The papers later corrected themselves. All 6 survived. After the Dreamland fire, Couney's operation did not become safer because the state embraced it. It became safer because he learned, adapted, and kept going. The moral panic focused on the carnival setting, not on the hospital refusal that made the carnival necessary. That inversion criticized the spectacle while accepting the abandonment shows up again and again in the documentation that does survive. By the time he mounted a major exhibit at the 1939 New York World's Fair, incubators were no longer a novelty. The crowds that once paid to stare now walked past, and the exhibit became a financial drag. Coney tried to donate his equipment to the city in 1940. The city declined. In 1943, a major hospital opened one of the first dedicated premature infant wards in New York, using techniques and hardware that echoed what he had demonstrated for decades, without needing his brand attached. He died on the 1st of March 1950, in Coney Island. Broke. His daughter Hildegard, born 6 weeks premature in 1907, treated in his own incubators, survived, became a nurse, and worked beside him. She never had children. There is no direct line of descendants to curate a tidy legacy, and no complete archive to replace the missing institutional memory. Authorities used the incident to argue that premature infant care should happen only in hospitals. It sounds sensible until you remember the hospitals still would not do it, not at scale, not with commitment, not for decades. So the man with the unstable biography kept operating. By the late 1930s, the exhibit drew fewer crowds. Incubators were no longer novel. He tried to donate equipment. The city declined. Hospitals eventually adopted the techniques and built wards that resembled what he had demonstrated in public. They did not need his name attached to the method once the method became respectable. Couney died in 1950, broke and largely forgotten. The incubators were scrapped. The records are incomplete. The babies he saved grew into ordinary lives. Many, never knowing their first days, were spent behind glass while strangers paid to stare. When people try to close the story neatly, they reach for a moral. Outsiders sometimes do what institutions won't. True and incomplete. The more disturbing moral is that institutions can outsource their moral failures to outsiders and then reclaim the credit later. Couney's tent did not merely rescue babies. It also gave hospitals an excuse not to build neonatal care. Outsourcing care to spectacle let respectable institutions keep their hands clean while benefiting from the results. And this brings me back to the question that still refuses to loosen. Where did the other babies go? The ones who were not brought to the incubators. The ones born in tenements to families who never heard of a carnival tent that could keep a 2-pound infant alive. The ones born too early in a hospital that would not waste resources. The ones whose births were never recorded because premature births were not considered worth recording. The ones who do not appear in census data in hospital logs, in birth certificates, in death certificates. The record cannot answer because the record was never built for those children. There are mundane explanations that are still unsettling. If hospitals quietly referred the hardest cases to Couney, then the missing babies are not missing at all. They are simply scattered across private arrangements, charity transfers, unlogged deaths, and ad hoc placements that never became centralized data. If midwives and tenement doctors avoided hospitals altogether, then entire streams of premature births could have lived and died inside apartments without ever touching a ledger. If authorities treated a premature infant as a non-person until it reached a certain weight or day count, then the record silence is not a mystery. It is policy expressed as omission. None of these require a conspiracy. All of them require a society comfortable with disappearance. They were born into a world that had already decided they were not worth counting. The only man who counted thousands of them did it with a name nobody could fully verify, credentials nobody could fully confirm, and a business model funded by quarters from people who came to watch oddities on their way to the roller coaster. 8,000 is a number that sounds like a statistic until you imagine it as 8,000 separate entrances into the world, 8,000 first breaths fought for in public, 8,000 parents told no by one institution and yes by a boardwalk. The question is still there. And it is not just about Couney. It is about the systems that decided which babies were worth saving, which were worth scoring, which were worth moving, and which were worth forgetting. Where did the other babies go? If we cannot answer, we should at least be honest about why. Because the world that lost them did not bother to count. And that comfort is the darkest inheritance of the story.